The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Beverly Hills mansion as David Sterling stood in his master bedroom, holding $30,000 worth of solid gold bars. His hands trembled slightly, not from the weight of the precious metal, but from what he was about to do. One by one, he placed each gleaming bar across his silk bedsheets, arranging them deliberately where they would catch the light. The golden pieces formed an unmistakable display of wealth, impossible to ignore, impossible to misinterpret. David adjusted the angle of his security camera, ensuring it would capture every moment of what he believed would be a defining test of human character. "This will prove everything," he whispered to himself, stepping back to admire his setup. The gold bars sparkled like fallen stars against the pristine white sheets. Sarah Washington would arrive for work in exactly 30 minutes. David was absolutely certain he knew how this would end. After all, everyone had their breaking point, especially someone in her circumstances. He was about to discover just how wrong a brilliant man could be. 5 a.m. While most of Beverly Hills still slept, Sarah Washington sat in her aging Honda Civic, connecting to a scratchy video call with her son, Marcus. 3,000 miles away, he hunched over medical textbooks in his tiny Howard University dorm room, already dressed in scrubs for his early hospital volunteer shift. "Mom, you look tired," Marcus said, his voice filled with the kind of gentle concern that made Sarah's heart ache with pride. "I'm fine, baby. Tell me about your anatomy exam." Marcus lit up, launching into excited details about cardiovascular systems and surgical procedures. Behind him, Sarah could see his pre-med textbooks stacked high, the books that cost more than she made in 2 weeks. On his desk sat an acceptance letter to Johns Hopkins Medical School. His dream, their dream, with the financial aid package that covered almost everything. Almost. "The final tuition deposit is due in 3 weeks, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice casual. $8,500. "But Mom, don't worry about—" "We'll figure it out," Sarah interrupted gently. "We always do." The call ended, and Sarah pulled out her worn notebook, running the numbers again. After working 3 jobs, cleaning David's mansion, weekend shifts at the hospital cafeteria, and evening babysitting, she had saved $6,200. She needed $2,300 more in 21 days. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, the same one she'd said every morning since her husband Jerome died from COVID 3 years ago, leaving behind medical bills that had swallowed their life savings. "Give me strength. Give me wisdom. And please, let my boy become the doctor his father always knew he could be." Meanwhile, in the mansion she would clean in 2 hours. David Sterling sat alone at a dining table built for 20. The morning news droned from a 70-inch screen, filled with stories about economic hardship and rising crime rates. A perfectly prepared breakfast lay before him, served by a chef he rarely spoke to, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. "Unemployment drives people to desperate measures," the news anchor reported. Local businesses report increased theft as families struggle to make ends meet. David nodded thoughtfully, scrolling through articles on his tablet about employee dishonesty and workplace theft. He'd built his tech empire on understanding human behavior, on predicting what people would do under pressure. In his experience, desperation always won over virtue. It was simple psychology. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd never actually known anyone truly desperate. By 7:30, Sarah moved through David's home office with the quiet efficiency she'd perfected over 2 years of working for him. She dusted his awards carefully. Tech Innovator of the Year, Humanitarian Leader, Visionary CEO, treating each trophy with the same respect she'd shown the medical equipment during her brief stint as a hospital aide before Jerome got sick. David watched from his desk, observing the way she straightened his family photos with gentle precision, how she watered his plants with care most people reserved for their own homes. She was professional, punctual, and thorough. But he still wondered about her character when truly tested. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, Sarah said with her usual polite smile. Morning, Sarah. How's your son doing? Very well. Thank you for asking. He's loving medical school prep. David nodded, making a mental note. Medical school was expensive. Sarah was a single mother working as domestic help. The math was simple. She needed money, and people in need made compromises. That evening, as David played golf at his exclusive country club, he shared his theory with his longtime friend Robert Carter, a federal judge who'd known David since Harvard. I'm thinking about conducting a little experiment, David said, lining up his putt, testing whether desperation really does override moral character. Robert frowned. David, that sounds scientific, objective. I've been reading about behavioral economics, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When survival is threatened, ethics become flexible. And you plan to test this? David's putt rolled past the hole. By creating a situation where someone has to choose between integrity and opportunity. I predict the outcome will be quite illuminating. Robert shook his head. Sometimes I think your biggest blind spot is thinking you understand people you've never actually known. But David wasn't listening. He was already planning tomorrow morning's test, convinced he could predict human nature as easily as he'd predicted market trends. He had no idea he was about to meet someone who would redefine everything he thought he knew about dignity. During her lunch break, Sarah sat in her car outside a McDonald's, counting crumpled $20 bills for the third time that week. The math hadn't changed. $6,200 in her mason jar at home. $8,500 needed for Marcus's final deposit. 17 days left. She pulled out her phone and opened her calculator app, running the numbers again. Her salary from David's house, $400 a week. Weekend cafeteria shifts, $150. Evening babysitting, another $100. Even if she picked up extra shifts, worked every single day without rest, she'd still fall short by $300. Sarah's hands shook as she opened her text messages. 3 different cleaning agencies had been calling, offering additional work. The Hendersons needed weekend help. Mrs. Kim required someone to care for her elderly mother overnight. But Sarah was already working 16-hour days. There were only so many hours in a week, only so much her body could take. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Mom, got my first paycheck from the lab work. $50. I'm contributing. Attached was a photo of him grinning beside a microscope, his scrubs pristine, his smile radiating the kind of joy that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Sarah typed back, So proud of you, baby. Focus on your studies. Love you. What she didn't type, that $50 was beautiful, but it wouldn't solve their problem. That she was considering applying for a payday loan with crushing interest rates. That sometimes, late at night, she wondered if she was foolish to dream so big for a boy whose father had died, leaving them drowning in debt. She closed her eyes and tried to remember Jerome's voice. That boy's got healing hands, Sarah. He's going to save lives. We just got to get him there. Meanwhile, David Sterling stood on the 15th green at Riviera Country Club, explaining his experiment to Robert Carter with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own wisdom. It's basic behavioral psychology, David said, adjusting his grip on his 9-iron. When people are desperate enough, moral boundaries become flexible. I'm simply creating a controlled environment to observe this principle in action. Robert's shot sailed into a sand trap. You're talking about a human being, not a lab rat. Someone who works in your home, who trusts you. Exactly. Which makes the test more authentic. David's swing was perfect, his ball landing inches from the pin. Sarah seems like a nice woman, very professional, but she's got financial pressures. Medical school for her son, bills to pay. I guarantee you, faced with $30,000 in untraceable gold and the belief that no one would know, human nature will assert itself. And what if you're wrong? David laughed, the sound echoing across the manicured fairway. I'm not. I've built a billion-dollar company on understanding human behavior. Desperation is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're a saint. Everyone has a breaking point. Robert shook his head. Sometimes your privilege blinds you, David. You think you understand struggle because you've read about it. But David had already moved on, mentally cataloging the details of tomorrow's test. He was as certain of the outcome as he was of the sunrise. Back at the mansion that afternoon, Sarah worked in David's mother's rose garden, carefully pruning the antique varieties that had been Elena Sterling's pride and joy. David's assistant had mentioned that the garden needed attention, and Sarah had volunteered, recognizing the delicate care these heritage roses required. Each bloom was different. Mr. Lincoln's deep red petals, the pale pink of Eden climbers, the pure white of iceberg shrubs. Sarah had learned their names from the small plaques Elena Sterling had placed beside each variety. The garden was clearly a labor of love, abandoned after its creator's death 5 years ago. As Sarah worked, she noticed David watching from his study window. She couldn't see his expression, but there was something in his posture that reminded her of Marcus when he was thinking hard about a problem. She carefully staked a climbing rose that had grown heavy with blooms, securing it with the same gentle firmness she'd once used wrapping Jerome's infected wounds during his final weeks. From his window, David found himself unexpectedly moved by the sight. His mother had spent hours in that garden, claiming the roses responded to love as much as water and sunlight. David had always thought it was sentimentality, but watching Sarah work with such careful attention to each plant, he remembered Elena saying, "You can tell everything about a person's character by how they treat something that can't thank them." Sarah found an old photo tucked behind one of the plant markers. Elena Sterling kneeling among her roses, her face radiant with joy. She placed it carefully on the garden bench where David would find it. That evening, David sat in his study, finalizing his test. He'd selected the gold bars carefully, pieces small enough to pocket easily, valuable enough to solve serious financial problems. He'd calculated the camera angle to capture everything clearly. He'd even timed it for the morning when the sunlight would make the gold impossible to ignore. In his leather-bound notebook, he wrote his prediction. The subject will take 2 or 3 pieces, believing the amount won't be noticed. Rational choice given financial pressure. Confirms hypothesis about desperation overriding moral conditioning. David closed the notebook and smiled. Tomorrow would prove everything he believed about people, about human nature, about the predictable way desperation corrupted even the best intentions. He had no idea he was about to discover that dignity could shine brighter than gold. The phone rang at 6 a.m. on Tuesday morning, jolting Sarah from her brief sleep. She'd been working until midnight, cleaning office buildings downtown to scrape together every possible dollar. Her body ached, but Marcus's name on the caller ID instantly cleared the fog from her mind. "Mom!" His voice crackled with excitement and urgency. "You won't believe what just happened!" Sarah sat up in her narrow bed, instantly alert. "What is it, baby? Are you okay?" "Better than okay. Dr. Martinez just called. You remember her, the Johns Hopkins admissions director? There's a special scholarship opportunity, a full ride plus stipend. But Mom, here's the thing. The application fee is $2,300 and it's due by tomorrow at midnight." Sarah's heart stopped. $2,300. The exact amount she still needed for his tuition deposit. "It's perfect timing, right?" Marcus continued, breathless. "Like God knew exactly what we needed. The scholarship covers everything, tuition, living expenses, even books. I'd be the first in our family to graduate debt-free. Can you believe it?" Sarah's throat tightened. She could hear the joy in her son's voice, the hope that finally, their struggles might be ending. That's wonderful, Marcus. Dr. Martinez said only 12 students nationwide get this opportunity. Mom, this could change everything. No more working 3 jobs, no more stress about money. Jerome Jr. could follow his dreams too. The mention of Jerome's name, what they'd planned to name their second child before the medical bills consumed their lives, nearly broke Sarah's composure. She pressed her hand to her mouth, steadying her voice. How do we apply? I can do everything online, but the application fee has to be paid by tomorrow night. Can we make it work? I know it's everything we've saved, but Mom, this is it. This is our shot. Sarah stared at the mason jar on her dresser, knowing it contained exactly $6,200. Taking out $2,300 would leave her short for Marcus's regular tuition deposit. But if he got this scholarship... Yes, she whispered. We'll make it work. Really? Mom, are you sure? I know how hard you've worked to save that money. Baby, this is what we've been working for. Send me the payment details. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the dark, calculating impossible math. If Marcus didn't get the scholarship, she'd have neither the deposit money nor the application fee. They'd lose everything. But if he did get it... She dressed for work with shaking hands, praying harder than she had since Jerome's final days in the hospital. At the Sterling mansion, David woke with the satisfaction of a man about to prove his point. He'd slept well, dreaming of vindication, of the moment when his carefully constructed test would demonstrate the fundamental truth about human nature under pressure. He arranged the gold bars with scientific precision across his pristine bedsheets. 30 pieces, each worth roughly $1,000. Enough to solve most people's immediate problems. Small enough to pocket without obvious detection. Positioned where the morning light would make them absolutely impossible to miss. David adjusted his hidden camera one final time, ensuring the angle captured both the gold and whoever entered the room. He'd reviewed the footage from previous weeks, studying Sarah's patterns. She always cleaned his bedroom around 8:30, always worked systematically from left to right, always handled his personal items with careful respect. Today would be different. Textbook desperation psychology, David muttered, checking his watch. Financial pressure plus opportunity equals predictable behavior. He placed his leather notebook nearby, ready to document the precise moment when integrity gave way to necessity. This would make an excellent case study for the behavioral economics paper he'd been considering writing. At 8:25, Sarah climbed the mansion's curved staircase with her usual cleaning supplies, her mind churning with thoughts of Marcus's scholarship application. She'd spent the drive to work calculating timelines, trying to figure out how to juggle the payment schedule if things went wrong. The scholarship application deadline was tomorrow night. The tuition deposit deadline was in 15 days. If she paid for the application and Marcus didn't get the scholarship, they'd lose everything. But if she didn't pay for the application, they'd definitely lose everything. Sarah paused outside David's bedroom door, steadying herself. She thought of Jerome, of his absolute faith in their son's future. That boy's going to heal people, Sarah. We just got to get him there. She turned the door handle and stepped inside. The gold bars hit her like a physical blow. 30 gleaming pieces scattered across the silk bedsheets, catching the morning sunlight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. Each bar roughly the size of a smartphone, each one worth more than she made in a month. Sarah froze completely. For 30 seconds, she didn't breathe. The gold seemed to pulse with possibility. $2,300. That's all she needed. Just 3 pieces from the dozens spread across the bed. David Sterling had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Would he even notice? She thought of Marcus's voice, bright with hope about the scholarship. She thought of Jerome's medical bills, still arriving 2 years after his death. She thought of the other families at the hospital who'd lost everything to save someone they loved. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down her cleaning supplies. The gold bars blazed in the sunlight, beautiful and terrible and utterly tempting. Each piece represented hours of her life she could reclaim, nights she could sleep instead of working, dreams she could stop deferring. But Sarah Washington had been raised by a grandmother who cleaned other people's houses during the day and took in ironing at night, who'd never taken so much as a safety pin that didn't belong to her. Sarah had nursed dying patients who trusted her with their medications, their jewelry, their final words. Sarah had promised a dying husband that she'd raise their son with integrity intact. She began to clean. Carefully, methodically, Sarah dusted around each gold bar without touching a single piece. She changed the bed sheets by lifting each bar gently, placing it on the nightstand, then returning it to its exact position. She vacuumed around the precious metal with the same steady precision she brought to every task. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and the easiest choice she'd ever made. When the room was spotless, Sarah pulled out a piece of paper and wrote in her careful script, "Mr. Sterling, I saw your test. I understand why you needed to know. I hope I passed. Sarah." She placed the note on his nightstand, alongside a photo of Marcus in his hospital scrubs, volunteering at the children's ward. Then she gathered her supplies and left, closing the door softly behind her. David found the note 47 minutes later, and for the first time in his privileged life, discovered what it felt like to be completely wrong about everything. David Sterling's hands shook as he read the note for the 5th time in 10 minutes. 12 words written in careful script on a piece of notebook paper. "Mr. Sterling, I saw your test. I understand why you needed to know. I hope I passed." She knew. Sarah had known exactly what he was doing, and she'd played along anyway. The photo beside the note showed a young man in scrubs, a stethoscope around his neck, kneeling beside a hospital bed where a small child was laughing. The resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable. The same gentle eyes, the same quiet strength in his posture. On the back, someone had written, "Marcus Washington, Children's Hospital volunteer, future pediatric surgeon." David sank into his leather chair, staring at the untouched gold bars still scattered across his bed. In 30 years of business, he'd never been so fundamentally wrong about anything. His behavioral prediction model hadn't just failed, it had been obliterated by a reality he couldn't comprehend. "She saw the test," he whispered to the empty room. She knew, and she still... David rushed to his security system, rewinding the footage to 8:30 that morning. He watched Sarah enter his bedroom, watched her body language as she discovered the gold. The footage captured everything. Her complete stillness for those crucial 30 seconds. The moment when temptation and necessity warred across her features. He watched her hands tremble as she picked up her cleaning supplies. He watched her work around each piece of gold with deliberate care, never allowing herself to so much as brush against the precious metal. Most remarkably, he watched her face, not the expression of someone fighting temptation, but someone making a choice she'd already made long ago. David rewound and watched again, then again. Each viewing revealed new details that demolished his assumptions. Sarah hadn't struggled with the decision, she'd simply honored who she was, regardless of what it cost her. "Robert was right," David muttered, remembering his friend's warning about not understanding people he'd never known. "I don't know anything about real people at all." That afternoon, David did something he'd never done before. He investigated one of his employees' personal lives, not to protect himself, but to understand how badly he'd misjudged someone. Sarah Washington, age 48, widow. Lost her husband, Jerome Washington, 3 years ago to COVID-19 complications. Jerome had been a respiratory therapist at Cedars-Sinai, working the COVID wards until he contracted the virus himself. Medical bills from his 3-month ICU stay, $237,000. David's throat tightened as he read the insurance documents. Jerome's policy had covered 60%. The remaining debt had consumed their savings, their home equity, Jerome's life insurance, and Sarah's retirement fund. Current debts, $47,000 in medical bills, still accruing interest. Son Marcus Washington, age 19. Pre-med student at Howard University with a 3.9 GPA. Recipient of partial scholarship covering 70% of tuition. Gap in funding requiring family contribution. $8,500 per semester. David clicked through Marcus's academic records. Dean's list every semester. Volunteer work at children's hospitals. Research assistant in a genetics lab. letters of recommendation that described him as extraordinarily compassionate and destined for medical leadership. Sarah's employment history painted the picture of a woman rebuilding from catastrophe. Before Jerome's illness, she'd worked part-time as a hospital aide while he carried their insurance. After his death, she'd taken whatever jobs she could find: cleaning services, cafeteria work, elderly care. David found her application for work at his house 2 years ago. Under previous experience, she'd written patient care, medical support, grief counseling volunteer. Under why are you applying for this position, her answer was simple: to provide for my son's education. The reference letters nearly broke David's heart. Former colleagues described Sarah as the person we turn to in our darkest moments, someone who brought dignity to the hardest situations. One letter from a doctor at Cedars-Sinai read, "If I were dying, I would want Sarah Washington holding my hand." David pushed away from his computer, overwhelmed by the scope of his ignorance. He'd tested someone who'd already passed every test life could offer. He'd questioned the integrity of someone who'd sacrificed everything for love and never compromised her principles. But the detail that destroyed him completely was buried in Marcus's scholarship applications. In his personal essay, Marcus had written, "My mother taught me that integrity isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about who you choose to be when no one would ever know the difference. She shows me every day that dignity isn't something poverty can take away." David closed his laptop and walked to his window, staring out at the rose garden where Sarah had worked with such care the day before. He thought about his mother's belief that you could judge character by how people treated things that couldn't thank them. Sarah had treated his mother's roses with love. She'd treated his home with respect. She'd treated his ridiculous test with grace he didn't deserve. And tomorrow she would return to work as if nothing had changed, probably believing she'd failed some crucial evaluation, unaware that she'd taught him more about human nature in one morning than 40 years of business had managed. David spent the rest of the afternoon rehearsing conversations, writing and discarding scripts for the most important discussion of his life. How did you apologize for fundamentally misunderstanding someone's character? How did you admit that your privilege had blinded you to the reality of dignity under pressure? "Sarah," he practiced saying aloud, "I need to apologize." Too formal. "I was wrong about you." Too clinical. "You're remarkable." Too patronizing. Nothing felt adequate to bridge the chasm between who he'd assumed she was and who she actually was. David looked again at Marcus's photo, at the young man who'd inherited his mother's gentle strength and was channeling it toward healing others. He thought about Sarah working 3 jobs to fund her son's dreams, about Jerome dying in service to others, about a family that had lost everything but never lost themselves. Tomorrow morning, David Sterling would attempt to have the first genuine conversation of his adult life. He would try to become worthy of the grace Sarah had already shown him. He had no idea if it was even possible, but for the first time in decades, David Sterling was more interested in learning than in being right. The next morning, David Sterling paced his study like a caged animal, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Sarah always arrived at 7:45, always parked in the side driveway, always entered through the service entrance with a quiet professionalism that now filled him with shame. At 7:53, he heard her car door close. David's heart hammered as he walked toward the kitchen, intercepting Sarah as she gathered her cleaning supplies from the utility closet. "Sarah," his voice cracked slightly. Could we talk for a moment?" Sarah turned, her expression neutral but attentive. She'd worked for wealthy people long enough to recognize when something significant was happening. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Is everything all right?" David gestured toward the morning room, where sunlight streamed through the French doors overlooking his mother's rose garden. Sarah followed, setting down her supplies, her posture straight but cautious. "Please, sit," David said, his usual commanding tone replaced by something softer, more uncertain. Sarah remained standing. I prefer to stand, sir, if that's all right. The formality in her voice cut through David like glass. He realized that for 2 years he'd never actually invited her to sit in his presence, never offered her coffee, never treated her as anything more than an efficient service provider. Sarah, David's prepared words vanished. I found your note yesterday. I see. Sarah's voice remained steady, but David caught the slight tightening around her eyes. I hope my work was satisfactory, Mr. Sterling. Satisfactory? David laughed, but it came out hollow, broken. Sarah, you passed a test I had no right to give you, a test that revealed more about my character than yours. Sarah's composure flickered for just a moment. I'm not sure I understand. The gold bars. I put them there deliberately. I was testing whether you would... David's face burned with shame. I was testing whether you would steal from me. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sarah's expression shifted through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been disappointment. I see, she said finally. May I ask why? David sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his 55 years. Because I'm an ignorant man who thought he understood people he'd never bothered to know. Because I believed that desperation always defeats integrity. Because His voice dropped to a whisper. Because I had unconscious assumptions about who you are based on nothing more than your circumstances. Sarah absorbed this with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. When she finally spoke, her voice held no anger, only a kind of tired sadness. What did you expect me to do, Mr. Sterling? I expected you to take some of the gold. I thought... David's voice broke entirely. I thought financial pressure would make you compromise your values. I was completely, utterly wrong. And if I had taken the gold? David met her eyes for the first time in their conversation. I would have fired you immediately. I would have believed it confirmed everything I thought about people in difficult circumstances. The weight of his admission hung heavy in the morning air. Sarah nodded slowly, processing the full scope of what David was telling her. Why are you sharing this with me now? She asked. Because after I found your note, I did something I've never done before. I looked into your life. I learned about Jerome, about your medical bills, about Marcus's scholarship needs. I learned that you've been working 3 jobs to pay for your son's education while managing debt that would destroy most people. David's voice gained strength as he continued. I learned that you've been volunteering at grief counseling groups while dealing with your own loss. I learned that everyone who knows you describes you as someone they'd want beside them in their darkest moments. Sarah's professional mask began to soften. Mr. Sterling, I learned about Marcus's scholarship application, the one that requires $2,300 by tonight, the exact amount that 3 pieces of gold would have provided. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't told anyone about the scholarship deadline, hadn't mentioned the impossible choice between the application fee and Marcus's tuition deposit. How could you possibly know that? Because I spent yesterday trying to understand how someone could be facing the kind of financial pressure that should make taking that gold a rational choice, and still walk away without touching a single piece. David stood, moving to the window where Sarah's careful work in the garden was visible. Your son is going to be a remarkable doctor, isn't he? He's everything good his father was and more. The pride in Sarah's voice was unmistakable. Jerome was a respiratory therapist who worked the COVID wards. Sarah's composure finally cracked just slightly. You researched my husband? I needed to understand what kind of people could face catastrophic loss and still choose integrity over survival. I needed to understand what I was really testing yesterday. David turned from the window, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Your husband died serving others. You're working yourself to exhaustion so your son can heal children, and I thought you might steal from me because you needed money. Mr. Sterling, David, please, I don't deserve the formality you've always shown me. Sarah studied his face, seeing something she'd never witnessed before. Genuine vulnerability, real shame, the kind of raw honesty that only came from confronting uncomfortable truths about oneself. "We all make assumptions," she said gently. "The important thing is what we do when we realize we're wrong. How can you be kind to me right now? I questioned your character, tested your integrity, assumed the worst about who you are as a person." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "My grandmother cleaned houses for 50 years. She told me once that rich people sometimes forgot that we were fully human, that we had the same capacity for love and loss and moral choice that they did. She said the trick was to never let their limitations become our limitations." David felt something crack open in his chest. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." "She was, and she taught me that dignity isn't about what other people think of you. It's about who you choose to be when no one would ever know the difference." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "Yesterday morning I stood in your bedroom looking at enough gold to solve every financial problem I have. For 30 seconds I calculated what 3 pieces would mean for my family. But then I remembered something my husband used to say." "What was that?" "Jerome always told Marcus that integrity was like a muscle. The more you exercised it, the stronger it became. He said that if you compromise your values when things get hard, you lose the ability to trust yourself when things get harder." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "I couldn't take your gold because I couldn't look my son in the eye knowing I'd taught him that desperation justifies dishonesty." David broke completely. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside him, years of isolation and privilege and fundamental misunderstanding about what it meant to be human. He cried for his ignorance, for his assumptions, for the casual way he'd tested someone whose character was forged in fires he'd never faced. "I'm so sorry," he gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry I misjudged you. I'm sorry I tested you. I'm sorry I've been so blind to who you really are." And then Sarah did something that shattered David's world completely. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his shoulder, offering comfort to the man who had just confessed to testing her integrity. "It's all right," she said softly. "We all have room to grow." David looked up at her through his tears, seeing clearly for the first time the extraordinary human being who had been working in his home for 2 years, invisible to him until this moment. "How?" he whispered. "How are you not angry with me?" "Because anger would change me, not you. And because—" Sarah smiled, the first truly warm expression she'd ever shown him. "Because I think this conversation means you're ready to see things differently." David wiped his eyes, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. "I want to help with Marcus's scholarship application fee. Not as charity, not as guilt money, but because investing in someone like him is the smartest thing I could possibly do with my money." "That's very generous, but please, let me do this one thing right. Your son is going to heal people, Sarah. Let me be part of making that possible." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing sincerity where before there had only been assumptions. "All right," she said quietly, "but on one condition. Anything. I want you to meet Marcus when he comes home for winter break. I want you to see who he is, not just what he might become." David nodded eagerly. "I'd be honored." As they stood in the morning light, 2 people from completely different worlds began to see each other clearly for the first time. David Sterling, billionaire tech mogul, was about to discover what it really meant to be wealthy. And Sarah Washington, domestic worker and mother, was about to teach him that the greatest treasures in life had nothing to do with gold. But first, there was a scholarship application to submit and a young man's dreams to secure. The real transformation was just beginning. Within an hour, David Sterling had done something he'd never done in 4 decades of business. He'd acted on pure instinct instead of calculated strategy. The wire transfer confirmation sat on his desk. $2,300 sent directly to Johns Hopkins University for Marcus Washington's scholarship application fee. But as he stared at the receipt, David realized the money felt insignificant compared to what Sarah had given him, a completely new understanding of what strength looked like. "Sarah," he said, finding her in the kitchen where she'd quietly resumed her work. "The application fee is handled. Marcus can submit everything today." Sarah set down the dish towel she'd been folding, her eyes bright with gratitude and something else David couldn't quite identify. "Thank you. This means everything to our family. It means everything to me that you'd let me help." David hesitated, then continued. "But I wonder, would you be willing to teach me something else?" "What do you mean?" David felt like a child asking to join a game he didn't understand. "You mentioned Marcus volunteers at a children's hospital. I've donated to hospitals for years, written checks to medical charities, but I've never actually seen what that money does. Would you think less of me if I admitted I don't really know how my donations help people?" Sarah studied his face with the careful attention she'd once reserved for reading patients' vital signs. She saw genuine curiosity where before there had been assumptions, humility where there had been certainty. "You want to volunteer?" "I want to understand. I want to see what you and Marcus see when you choose to spend your free time helping others instead of—" David gestured vaguely at his mansion. "Instead of collecting more things I don't need." "It's hard work," Sarah said gently. "Emotional work. You see people at their most vulnerable." "Maybe that's exactly what I need to see." 3 days later, David Sterling walked through the corridors of Children's Hospital of Los Angeles wearing scrubs that felt foreign and humbling. Beside him, Sarah moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in places where healing happened. "The thing to remember," Sarah said as they approached the pediatric ward, "is that these children are still children first. They want to laugh, to play, to feel normal. The illness is just one part of their story." David nodded, his usual commanding presence replaced by nervous uncertainty. He'd never been around seriously ill children. He'd certainly never been expected to bring them comfort. Their first stop was the play area, where a dozen children in various stages of treatment were engaged in art therapy. David watched Sarah kneel beside a 6-year-old girl whose head was covered by a bright purple bandana. "Miss Sarah," the little girl exclaimed, abandoning her painting to hug Sarah tightly. "I finished the butterfly picture for my mama." "Let me see, Destiny." Sarah's voice carried the same gentle warmth she'd used comforting David 3 days earlier. "Oh, this is beautiful. Look at all these colors." "Mr. David," Sarah said, turning to include him, "this is Destiny. She's the best artist on the whole floor." Destiny looked up at David with the frank curiosity of childhood untempered by social expectations. "Are you Miss Sarah's friend?" David glanced at Sarah, realizing he didn't know how to answer. Were they friends? The question felt simultaneously too simple and impossibly complex. "I'm learning to be," he said finally. "That's good," Destiny announced with 6-year-old authority. "Miss Sarah is the nicest person in the whole world. She taught me that butterflies have to stay in their cocoons until they're strong enough to fly, just like me staying in the hospital until I'm strong enough to go home." David spent the next 2 hours moving through the ward in a state of controlled wonder. He watched Sarah help a teenager with leukemia finish a college application essay. He observed her reading to a boy whose parents couldn't visit during their work hours. He saw her simply sit in comfortable silence with a girl who was too tired to talk but didn't want to be alone. Most remarkably, he watched the way every child's face lit up when they saw Sarah approaching. She wasn't just a volunteer to them. She was a source of stability, of unconditional care, of the kind of love that asked for nothing in return. "How do you do it?" David asked during their lunch break in the hospital cafeteria. "How do you give so much when you're dealing with your own challenges?" Sarah stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Jerome used to say that healing wasn't just medical. He said sometimes people needed someone to see their whole story, not just their problem. When I'm here, I'm not thinking about bills or schedules. I'm just present with whatever these children need. But doesn't it drain you? All this giving when you're still rebuilding your own life? Actually, it fills me up. Sarah's smile was radiant. When Destiny hugs me, when Marcus calls to tell me about a patient he helped, when I see healing happening, that's when I feel closest to Jerome, like we're still working together, still choosing love over fear. David sat in the fluorescent lighting of the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the quiet conversations of families navigating the most difficult chapters of their lives, and felt something shift permanently in his understanding of wealth. He'd spent his entire adult life accumulating resources, measuring success by financial metrics, believing that having more somehow made him more valuable. But watching Sarah move through that hospital, seeing the way her presence alone could transform a child's difficult day into something bearable, David realized he'd been measuring the wrong things entirely. "Sarah," he said quietly, "would you help me learn how to be useful instead of just rich?" The question hung between them, simple and profound and utterly sincere. "I think," Sarah said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand, "that's exactly what Jerome would have wanted to hear." For the first time in his life, David Sterling felt genuinely wealthy. 2 years later, David Sterling stood in the back of Johns Hopkins University's medical school auditorium, watching Marcus Washington cross the stage to receive his Doctor of Medicine degree. The young man's face radiated the same quiet strength David had come to recognize in his mother, but there was something else there too, a joy that came from dreams finally realized. "Dr. Marcus Washington," the dean announced, "graduating summa cum laude, recipient of the Sterling Washington Scholarship for Medical Excellence." The scholarship that bore both their names had grown from that desperate $2,300 application fee into a full program supporting 50 medical students annually. But watching Marcus accept his diploma, David knew the real return on investment wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in lives that would be saved by doctors who understood that healing required both clinical expertise and human compassion. Sarah sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son achieve what she and Jerome had dreamed of during those late-night conversations about his future. Beside her sat David, applauding with the fierce pride of someone who'd learned that other people's success could be more satisfying than his own achievements. After the ceremony, Marcus found them in the crowd, his diploma clutched in one hand, his other arm wrapped around his mother. "Dr. Washington," David said formally, then broke into a grin. "That has a nice ring to it." "It does, doesn't it?" Marcus laughed, then grew serious. "Mr. David, I can't thank you enough for believing in me before you even knew me. Your mother taught me that character reveals itself in how we treat people who can't do anything for us," David replied. "You've been healing people since you were 19 years old. I just helped make it official." But Marcus's graduation was only the beginning of the transformation that had started with scattered gold bars and a handwritten note. The Sarah Washington Foundation for Medical Debt Relief had launched 6 months after that first conversation in David's morning room. What began as David's desire to learn how to be useful instead of just rich had evolved into a comprehensive program addressing the medical bankruptcy crisis that had destroyed Sarah's family and countless others. The foundation's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. They paid off medical debt directly, with no complicated applications or means of testing. Families like the Washingtons, people who'd lost everything trying to save someone they loved, received letters informing them their debts had been forgiven entirely. "We've helped over 3,000 families so far," Sarah told David as they reviewed the foundation's annual report in what had once been his formal dining room, now converted into their foundation headquarters. "But the ripple effects go so much further." She was right. Children whose college funds hadn't been depleted by medical bills were staying in school. Parents were starting small businesses instead of working 3 jobs to pay medical debt. Families were healing emotionally because they weren't drowning financially. The foundation had also pioneered medical debt prevention programs, working with hospitals to establish transparent pricing and payment plans that prevented families from falling into the same trap that had consumed the Washington's savings. "What I love most," David said, studying a thank you letter from a family in Detroit, "is that we're not just writing checks. We're changing how the system works." "Jerome would be so proud," Sarah said softly. "He always believed that if you fixed one broken thing properly, it would help fix 10 other broken things too." David had discovered that Sarah was right about healing being contagious. His other business ventures had begun incorporating the same principles they'd developed at the foundation: transparency, dignity, and the radical idea that success should be measured by positive impact rather than pure profit. But the moment that meant the most to both of them happened on a quiet Saturday morning in David's rose garden. Sarah knelt among the heritage roses that had brought them together, carefully pruning the Mr. Lincoln variety that had been Elena Sterling's favorite. The garden was thriving under her care, each plant reaching toward the sun with the confidence of something deeply rooted and well-tended. "You know," David said, joining her with his own pruning shears, "my mother always said you could judge people's character by how they treated things that couldn't thank them." "Your mother was a wise woman," Sarah replied, the same words she'd spoken 2 years ago in very different circumstances. "I think she would have loved you," David said. "I think she would have understood immediately what took me so long to see." They worked together in comfortable silence, 2 friends tending something beautiful that had grown from careful attention and mutual respect. The roses bloomed around them in spectacular profusion, red and pink and white and yellow, each variety distinct, but part of a greater whole. "David," Sarah said eventually, "can I tell you something Jerome used to say about gardens?" "Please." "He said that the most beautiful gardens were the ones where different varieties grew together, where each plant made the others stronger." Sarah smiled, her hands gentle on the climbing rose she was training along a trellis. "He said diversity wasn't just beautiful. It was essential for everything to thrive." David paused in his work, struck by the metaphor's deeper meaning. He was talking about more than gardens, wasn't he? "Jerome was always talking about more than gardens," Sarah laughed. "He saw connections everywhere." As the afternoon sun slanted through the rose arbor, David Sterling and Sarah Washington continued their work, tending beauty that would outlast them both. They'd learned that transformation wasn't a destination. It was a daily choice to see clearly, to choose connection over separation, to believe that dignity was every person's birthright regardless of their circumstances. Sometimes the greatest treasures really were found in the people you almost overlooked. Stories like Sarah's remind us that character isn't determined by bank accounts, and that the most profound changes often begin with the simplest acts of grace. Support medical debt relief programs in your community, and remember that dignity blooms in the most unexpected places. Follow for more stories celebrating the extraordinary strength of ordinary people.
At Black Voices Uncut, we don't polish away the pain or water down the message. We tell it like it is because the truth deserves nothing less. If today's story spoke to you, click like, join the conversation in the comments, and subscribe so you'll be here for the next Uncut Voice.